of sea ice through Bering Strait as possible habitat or ice flows for animals to use while resting during the migration period. So the results, looking at the local scale, the local hunters were able to provide quite high-resolution information about the types of ice flow sizes, large, very large ice thickness. And when we did our randomization test, we found that both walrus and bearded seals were most often recorded with pack ice visible from shore. But for bearded seals, we also commonly found they were reported when conditions of fast ice were described. Looking at the regional scales, the red stars indicate when bearded seals were most often reported, and the yellow stars indicate when walrus were most often reported. But for both bearded seals and walrus, typically they were reported when there was enough pack ice available through Bering Strait, so ice flows available as potential resting areas for animals during their spring migration. However, the walrus were also seen when there was sparser ice later into the migratory period compared to the bearded seals. Now, another interesting thing that we were able to find was that the community observers also frequently reported when they would see young animals, and the gray bars indicate when Bering Strait basically became mostly ice-free, and the dark circles indicate when young animals were reported. And for the most part, you'll find that young animals were only reported as long as there was some ice available through Bering Strait. So typically these young animals, walrus and bearded seals, would be found migrating as long as there was some ice available through the straits moving up north. So putting it all into context, again, a lot of the times biologists use whatever sea ice data is most readily available to them. And frequently this includes things such as sea ice concentration using passive microwave data. So we just quickly plotted what that looked like using these broad-scale remote sensing data. And then if you were to focus in using higher resolution MODIS imagery, you get a better idea of the types of ice you might find, where the leads might be, how large the ice flows are. But again, this doesn't give you the context of any possible hunting activities. So in order to do that, you really need to get the hunter's perspective. So in this case, Leonard Apungaluk from Gamble reported ice conditions surrounding our village is unchanged. Although larger ice flows were noted, there were open leads, but they did freeze over due to lower temperatures, and walrus were sighted further out on the ice. Another possible application for being able to tie in remote sensing data to community observations of changing sea ice conditions is the ability to get a general idea of when animals are migrating north to their summer foraging grounds. So here in early March, animals were seen observing past Gamble. In April, there's a greater spread with animals being seen further south of Gamble and past through Sabunga. In May, they're starting to be observed up going through past Wales and Shishmaref. And again, a greater spread during the month of June. So finally, their first are starting to get reported during the month of July. So in summary, this approach, even though it was more of an exploration of how to combine hunter observations of sea ice conditions at local scales with broad-scale remote sensing data, it did give some useful information. We did find that, as was expected, pack ice visible from shore was an important local-scale condition for observations of walrus and bearded seals. Observers were also able to provide information on the presence of fast ice, the ice thickness, movements of ice, currents, and temperature. They also reported things such as animal behavior when they were seen resting on the ice or swimming or even vocalizing. Using a full network of community observations, we were able to get an idea of how animal movements could be tracked over time, and also when observations of young animals were reported. Also, it's important to keep in mind that there are limitations for using hunter observations to get an ecological perspective of animal sea ice use. Some of these include biases from focusing mostly on nearshore observations and factors that limit hunters' ability to observe animals such as weather, wind, ice conditions, and economic constraints. And Overall, though, being able to combine both hunter observations with remote sensing imagery gives you a better idea of the joint sea ice use between hunters and animals. Finally, I wanted to acknowledge the collaborators, the Yupik and Inupiat sea ice experts from Wales, Barrow, and Gamble, my collaborator, Hayo Aiken from the University of Alaska Fairbanks. And in case there are a lot of time for questions, I also wanted to make a plug for Polar Week. The U.S. APECS group will be answering questions about polar research, so feel free to keep the conversation going on Twitter with the hashtag AskUSAPEX.
Thank you very much. We do have time for a question since we started a little bit late your presentation for one or two. So the first question we have is from Julianne, and she's and the question is, what motivated this study to be undertaken?
That's a good question. Mostly what started the motivation was that we observed in these sea ice observations that hunters were also reporting things about animals, walrus, whales, seals that were being observed, and we really wanted to just explore whether there was a way to try and make these data more useful for biologists and to make the hunters' observations really be more relevant to researchers.
And for a final question, is the walrus a prey of polar bear? And if so, are they using the ice sheet at the same time as the polar bear?
Yeah, walrus can be polar bear prey. It's not the most frequent prey type for polar bears. And yes, the ice sheet are important for polar bears to successfully capture walrus. But more than likely, walrus would be more vulnerable to polar bears as young animals resting on beaches.
Thank you very much. So we're going to move on our next presenter, Jordan Greger, which is based at the Université Laval in Quebec. Jordan is going to talk about ecology of arrowworms in the Arctic. Are they really the tiger of the plankton? So Jordan, if you can unmute yourself, the platform is yours. You need to unmute yourself, Jordan. We cannot hear you.